Welcome to the TEFL Training Institute podcast, the bite-sized TEFL podcast for teachers, trainers, and managers.
Hi everyone.
Hey Ross, so when you're planning a lesson, do you have a structure to help you form the lesson stagings?
It's a tricky question, right? Because there's a whole bunch of different ways, aren't there, of staging a lesson.
Different models, you mean?
Yeah, so I guess the most traditional one is PPP, present, practice, produce.
Any other models?
So there's like ESA, engage, study, activate. That's Jeremy Harmer's one. Jim Scrivener's one is ARC. There's also TTT, test, teach, test, where you do an activity or a task at the beginning, and then you do something similar again near the end and help students to notice the difference. And then maybe the most recent one of these, which I think is absolutely fantastic, is CAP, context analysis practice.
And actually this model is developed by Jason Anderson. So Jason is a teacher educator, consultant, and also award-winning author of books for English language teachers.
And he's just published an awesome book called the Trinity Cert TESOL Companion. Today we're going to interview Jason and ask him all about lesson staging.
Hi Jason, this is Tracy. How are you?
Hi Tracy, I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Hi Jason.
Hey there.
Could you start off by just introducing CAP to us as a lesson staging model?
Okay, well, CAP, or CAP, even CAPE as the alternative, is a 3 or 4 stage model which can be used in pre-service teacher training and also even for newly qualified teachers to help them to structure what we might call new language lessons or lessons with a language focus, whether that be grammar, functional language or vocabulary. It's an alternative to things like PPP, presentation, practice, production, or ESA, engage, study, activate, and one that emphasizes the importance of context. So the 3 stages are context, analysis, and practice, with an optional 4th stage, evaluation. In the context phase, the context for learning is established with the learners, and this could be either through the use of a text, the use of a situation in the classroom, or the use of images and even the learners. There is no one way that the model is prescribing to introduce context. It can be done in many ways. Following this, what tends to happen in many such lessons is some kind of language analysis phase. This can be kind of a study of a bit of grammar. It could be noticing aspects of a text structure, and it could be also just noticing functional exponents and how they're used in context. And then the final of the 3 kind of obligatory phases would be the practice phase. All contexts where this type of teaching is dominant always involve some kind of practice, whether that be controlled practice alone, free practice alone, or a combination, which tends to be more common, at least in terms of what's suggested on pre-service courses. And this may involve things like gap fills and drills for controlled practice, and things like role plays, discussion activities for free practice. And then the final evaluation stage is the kind of optional one, because it always depends on what the activities are. And often we find that evaluation is happening alongside the practice as a teacher is formatively assessing how well the learners are doing in the practice phase. But there are opportunities, especially for written text, but it could be also for spoken text, for peers, teacher, or even self-evaluation of anything that's been produced in the text, whether that be a role-play dialogue, a written text, or even just the ideas of a conversation.
Can you tell us then just a little bit about maybe how you feel it's different from, for example, PPP? Like, what do you think the main differences there? Because obviously that's something that gets used a lot on teacher training courses, doesn't it?
PPP kind of bundles a lot into the first phase. In its initial description, when Don Byrne invented it in 1976, based on an earlier model by Julian Dakin, he basically said that in the presentation phase, you present the grammar. That's what the teacher does. The teacher is a conductor, and they introduce the new language pretty much in a very explicit form. And that's fine. That's one way of doing it. But that isn't really what tends to happen in most classes, in most course books, and in most teacher training today. The context needs to be there. Now, the way that we've come to interpret PPP is that the contextualization must happen in that presentation phase. The problem is it isn't explicit either in the model presented by Don Byrne or indeed in the way that it's described, that context is essential to the introduction of new language. And as a result, trainee teachers often have difficulty either remembering that or working out how to do it to introduce context. The PPP model also includes the analysis in that first phase. So you've got two very important parts of the lesson bundled together. And then the emphasis is on practice and production, this idea that there has to be controlled and then freer practice, which is something on a personal level I think is generally true, but it always does depend. And it depends flexibly on what kind of language is being introduced, whether learners are expected to have receptive grasp of it or whether they're expected to produce it, whether it's the first time they've met it or not. And there are many situations where a teacher might want to do just free practice if they want to challenge the learners with the new language, or where indeed if they're learning, for example, the passive voice for the first time, they may just want to do a fairly controlled practice activity to help learners to manipulate it without necessarily expecting them to use passive voice fluently in spoken activities. So in terms of kind of the comparison with PPP, those differences I think are important for helping trainee teachers to understand it. ESA is another one which it can be compared to, and in the ESA model, which I think is a very good model as well, the emphasis at the start is on engaging the learners, which is something that cannot be underestimated. It is important. But the problem is that Harmer in the engage phase doesn't mention contextualization at all. He talks often about activities that could be used to contextualize the new language, but given that the aim of a new language lesson is to help learners to understand new language, then any model that seeks to support them in that context has got to draw a link between how the context provides a way of decoding the new language and how the analysis then draws upon it.
Jason, can you tell us then, because I think Tracy and I, we've both been teaching for about 10 years, and I think certainly when I was a new teacher, certainly the ESA seemed to be in vogue. When was there this focus or this emphasis on context begin in language teaching?
In the 1980s, because we're moving more to a communicative approach where learners are encouraged to decode the language for themselves rather than simply to repeat it, to practice it, and then somehow to absorb it that way. This importance of noticing, which was also something that appeared in the late 80s, early 90s, and that was also integrated into what you might call notions of best practice in pre-service teacher education. And you also see something happening in course books that prior to the first edition of Headway, course books would tend to have a dialogue with the new language in it. And in early strategies, for example, it tended to be a two-person dialogue and the language might be in there. So there would be context for it. But what you start to notice with Headway is that the context itself becomes image-oriented. And that led rise to, on pre-service courses in the 90s, what is sometimes called by pre-service trainers as new language from a situation, where you'd actually create a context in the classroom, whether that be with the learners, with a few pictures on the board, or with other images that you've got from somewhere.
So, Jason, when I'm doing the teacher training courses, and I realize it's really difficult for teachers to introduce context in their classes. So, for you, what are some typical ways teachers can introduce context in their classes?
Sure. Well, when I did my pre-service course in 96, new language from a situation was how I was expected to do context. And there is this used to lesson. It's called the used to lesson among teacher trainers. And it's kind of often the one that's shown on pre-service courses, how to do new language from a situation. You draw a picture of a guy in jail and then the same guy out of jail. And you elicit that one is present, one is past. And then with the students, you build up an understanding of this person. And that lesson has kind of become an archetype for the new language from a situation type of context. But alongside that, we see that I did some analysis of course books for an article I've written for the current edition of TEFL Voices called Context Analysis and Practice. And in that article, I actually looked at the ways that course books themselves were providing context, all the way back from the first edition of Headway Intermediate right up until the first edition of Life Intermediate in 2013, pretty much 30 years or so of course books and how they're introducing context in the first editions. And I found three basic types of context. There is image supported, where the course book is providing images, and those are primarily the resource that is used to help learners to understand who is talking, who to, why, where and when, and so on. Then you've got what I've called text integrated context, and this is something that appears in the late 90s but then seems to disappear after 2000. the learners are required to manipulate the text in some way. So it might be to reorder paragraphs. There may be sentences missing from the text and they have to put them back in. But then the third type that has become by far the most dominant one since 2000 is what I call extensive text context. Rather than having kind of a text which the learners manipulate, or rather than having images, they actually do a reading or a listening activity which they engage in for kind of, often you've got the gist task and then the detailed listening and reading task. And then after that, the new language is noticed in the text and then analysed.
So Jason, for some of the trainee teachers on the in-service or pre-service course, they have to plan the lesson from scratch. So the 3 ways actually introduce context, do you think also applicable for planning lessons from scratch?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, I should actually mention I didn't quite answer your question fully. Those are the 3 kinds I found when I was looking at the course books. But there are certain other types of things that course books can't do. So another really nice way to introduce context is when you come into the class and say to the student something about what happened to you or how you're feeling, and draw on that kind of context or interaction to create the context for the new language. And that is just as valid today as it's ever been. And it's not something that course books can easily show teachers how to do. And I would just say that all of those types of context are possible and they're useful. It may depend on learners' preferences. It may depend on the context in which the teacher is teaching. So whether the teacher is working, say, in the UK with a multilingual class or in a part of the world where learners expect a more traditional approach to the introduction of new language, then in those kind of situations, you might find maybe a short kind of text or just images used to introduce the new language. But the key thing that has to happen in that stage is that there has to be some kind of context provided.
Yeah, great.
Great. When do you think it's useful and when is it maybe not useful, or when is it a disadvantage for teachers to rely on a model for staging?
There's always this important question of description versus prescription in these models. Back in the mid-1990s, there was a rebellion against PPP. Because what had happened is it had been accepted as the default way of introducing new language. A lot of people were arguing we shouldn't be prescribing, we should be describing what happens in the lesson. And Jim Scrivener introduces, not quite there, but he also puts forward his ARC model, which was an alternative, a very interesting descriptive one, much more flexible than PPP. The key point here is that why these need to be scaffolding devices is because as teachers develop an understanding of what can and what often does happen in lessons, as they automate some of the processes that we find so challenging when we begin our pre-service courses, then they don't necessarily need to have a conscious model controlling what they do. You could look at an experienced teacher's lesson and you will see that there's context, you will see there's analysis and practice. But what you might find, for example, is that the analysis and practice, they flip. And so you've got a context practice and then analysis of any language that emerges in that. That's something that a task-based learning approach or a dogme approach would recommend. And then you can also see that the model itself can be broken down and little phases can be added in. So you might want to put in a little practice phase of some kind of discussion questions before the language is analysed, because the discussion itself could actually help to build up the context further. These models are great until you reach the point where you're asking questions about alternative ways of doing it. And that's the moment when as a teacher, usually a newly qualified teacher, but for some of us it can happen later in our career, where you start to question these models, and that's the point where I think they can be taken away.
Do you want to just tell us briefly where, if people want to find any of your books, but especially the new Cert TESOL course companion, where can they go to find that?
If anyone's interested in looking at any of my resources, the first place I'd recommend them to go to is to my website, jasonanderson.org.uk, where they'll find lots of free stuff. There's a page called Resources where they can download activities, ideas, try out things. There's also a page Publications where there's links to all of my articles, even the ones that are not open access in EOT Journal. There's a click through there where they can read about, for example, the research into PPP. There's also free links to the 2 articles on context analysis practice. And then if they want to buy, or they're interested in kind of even just browsing my books, then you'll find those on the page Publications as well. And all of them have links to amazon.co.uk where you can buy them. But of course, if you're not in the UK, then they're also available on amazon.com or through the local representative of Delta Publishing, which is also the Cengage National Geographic representative. They'll have copies of these books.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks again,
Yeah.
Jason.
For more podcasts, videos, and blogs, visit our website www.tefltraininginstitute.com.
If you've got a question or a topic you'd like us to discuss, leave us a comment.
And if you want to keep up to date with our latest content, add us on WeChat at TEFL Training Institute.
And if you enjoyed our podcast, please rate us on iTunes.